This heinous story, which took place in England, has over the years become one of the country's most famous criminal cases. A young woman was murdered while walking in the park with her 2-year-old son. The only witness was her child, and the police couldn't find the culprit for 16 years. When the case was solved, the police were accused of catastrophic unprofessionalism. It turned out that they had made a huge number of mistakes that had cost several lives. In this video, we will tell you how one murder story grew into something bigger over 16 years and how it all ended. Rachel Jane Nichol was born on November 23, 1968 in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent, full family. Her father was an army officer and her mother a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs, helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and she developed in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children. In 1988, when she was 20 years old, Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later they had a son, Alex. Together they moved to an area of London called Felham. By then she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years, and then try to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoy nature in solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:30 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one except for one witness, Rachel's son, Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin, white man with brown hair. Everyone in that park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspapers leaked information from the pathologist report Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police Society demanded that the sadist be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace in the first few weeks. They interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time, but all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer. But 1992 technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park. At the request of the police department, this profile, along with the sketch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that Stagg had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station, where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find 2 women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very park. In his defense, Colin said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time. In one of them, he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel. Except, they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released. On the advice of his lawyer, he agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. A Metropolitan Police officer, under the pseudonym Lizzie James, began writing Colin letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stagg had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that. Plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague. During the conversation, Lizzie, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stagg had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He was read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that under such pressure, he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged on for a year, which Stagg spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Colin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think that Stagg was the murderer, and they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passersby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nichol case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why? When they were all sure of Colin's involvement. By then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who saw the murderer. For a long time, no one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man on Rachel's clothes. Analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability, and in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible. Even in 2003, this tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people. And a year later in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who at the time had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice. Later, because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an air gun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything. And what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy, but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder. But again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police, at some point, figured out that one man was committing the crimes. From the words of witnesses, they compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime, which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper. A young mother, Samantha Bissett, was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to the Rachel case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stagg was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bissett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm. In his apartment, they found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel was murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him for the killer because they were still convinced Colin Stagg was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day. In 1995, Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for treatment, with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it. They feared it might aggravate Napper's mental status. Back to 2004, the new team of detectives on the Rachel Nichol case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect. After they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body, the results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects. In Napper's case, the results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further using new technology. On Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, he worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how he could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders. But the fact remains, he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. In the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession. On December 18, 2008, 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital under heavy guard. Most likely he will never be released, but the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring on Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a Catalogue of Wrong Decisions and Mistakes. And the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years, the whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed, however. All of the detectives involved in the case retired and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alex, he did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and in that moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. A 28-year-old woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home, leaving her bedroom light on. They had been looking for her for months, and at some point, the story began to resemble a detective series. The police had barely pursued the case, so the missing woman's parents turned to an independent team of former detectives, and it was only thanks to them that the gruesome truth came out. Kate Waring was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. She had 2 brothers and loving parents who tried to give their children the best of everything. Kate demonstrated a love for animals from a young age and started volunteering at various shelters from her teenage years. She also danced, had many friends, and was a very positive person. It seemed to everyone that the woman grew up in a very good environment, and in part, that was the case. But one day all of that changed. Shortly before going to college, she admitted to her parents that she had been abused as a child by someone close to her family. Apparently, she did not reveal his identity, as this information is nowhere to be found for Kate's parents. This revelation came as a real shock. They hadn't had the slightest inkling of what their daughter had been through for years. After the woman shared this terrible secret, her mother and father tried in every way to help her, but the consequences of such a trauma over the years only worsened. First, Kate developed problems with alcohol and later with illegal substances. At one point, her parents suggested she get treatment, and the woman agreed. They also encouraged her to go back to their home and live with her family, which was also supposed to help her deal with her problems. At that point, Kate was an adult and living on her own, but she agreed to come home nonetheless. At first, it seemed like therapy was really having a positive effect, but Kate was still unable to let go of the heavy weight of the past and start living life to the fullest. The psychiatrist she went to diagnosed her with depression, but at one point, everything changed. Her father, who constantly supported his daughter and tried his best to help her, offered to take a trip anywhere in the world that Kate chooses. The woman was excited by the idea and soon decided she wanted to go beyond the Arctic Circle. Her dream was to see polar bears. Despite the sad experience, she still had a great love for animals. They set about looking for suitable tours and soon bought tickets. They were to get to the Arctic Circle by ship, and Kate couldn't wait for this exciting journey. At this point, her parents watched as her depressed state was replaced with a cheerful and positive attitude. When they finally went on the trip, Kate was over the moon. She and her father had a great time. The woman gained a lot of positive emotions. On the ship that took them to the Arctic Circle, Kate met another tourist from Russia. Throughout the trip, they communicated and continued to correspond at the end of it. Kate developed a liking for him, and sometime after his arrival home, she decided to go to Russia. There they met again, and the woman even considered staying in the country longer, but she was prevented by problems with her visa renewal and Kate was forced to return home. In spite of this, it looked as if the woman had finally managed to overcome her depression. She planned to solve her visa problems back home and even began writing a book for her children. It seemed like her life was finally getting better. But on Saturday, June 12, 2009, everything changed. On that day, Kate was home alone while her family was away on business. The woman always called her father to tell him that she was okay, but not this time. Her father decided to call her himself, but Kate didn't pick up. After waiting a while, he asked his wife to come home and check on his daughter. Given her past problems with alcohol and illegal substances, her parents were still worried. When she arrived home, her mother didn't find Kate there, but here's what was strange. The light in her room was on. It looked as if the woman had gone out for a while and would be back soon. The mother waited a few hours, but Kate was still gone. She also discovered that her daughter had left important medications at home that needed to be taken regularly. Despite their concern, the parents decided not to panic and wait for their daughter to show up. After all, Kate was already 28 years old at the time, and her parents understood that she could live her life. The father made the decision to wait until Monday, after which he wanted to call the police. On Monday morning, the father received a call from the bank. An employee told him that a man had come into their office and tried to cash more than $4,000 in a check signed by Kate Waring. They could not reach the woman herself, and her father acted as a fiduciary on her account. The whole situation seemed extremely strange. The father knew for a fact that his daughter had only a few $100s in her account, and that was the reason the bank's security service decided to contact him. That said, the woman's own signature looked authentic. They also gave the name of the man who had brought this check. His name was Ethan Mack. The father did not know him, but because of what the bank said about Kate's signature, the real one assumed that this man was indeed an acquaintance of his daughter. Despite this, he still decided to go to the police because Kate was still not in contact. Detectives began investigating the man's disappearance, and the first thing they came up with were questions for Ethan. He stated that he had known Kate for years and that she had written him this check for her old debts. According to Ethan, he often gave her money for clothes, jewelry, and other purchases. After talking to Kate's acquaintances, the police did verify that she had been friends with Ethan for a long time. According to them, there had never been a romantic relationship between them, but they had always been close. Ethan himself said that he and Kate met Friday night and went out to eat at a restaurant. Afterward, he drove her home and left on his own business. He even showed the detectives correspondence with Kate confirming what he said about the dinner. Ethan allowed the detectives to inspect his home where he lived with his mother and his car. They found nothing suspicious, but the situation with the check still seemed odd to the police and they were in no hurry to clear him. Eventually, Ethan called the police station and rather harshly asked them to leave him alone. The police attempted to reconstruct the chronology of that Friday evening when Kate was last seen. She went to see her therapist in the afternoon, then went to the gym. Next, she went to the store and bought a bottle of wine. Surveillance cameras recorded her talking to someone on the phone at that moment. According to the investigation, she may have been talking to Ethan, who later picked her up and they went to a restaurant. The woman's parents recalled another disturbing fact. On the day of her disappearance, Kate told them she was in trouble. She refused to specify what it was about, and her parents didn't remember it until a few days later. Alas, none of this helped in any way with the search. As the weeks passed, the woman remained unreachable. Her parents thought the police weren't doing enough from Kate's troubled past. In August, however, the case was given a new chance, and a group of former police officers, led by a lawyer named Andy Savage, took on the case. This group had been investigating cold cases privately, and Kate Waring's case interested them. In all, the group consisted of 5 men, each of whom had extensive law enforcement experience. One of them was former Detective James Randolph, who first examined Kate's bedroom. There, he singled out 2 suspicious things. First, his attention was drawn to a package of medication that the woman was taking on a regular basis. Her parents assured him that she would never skip a drug of her own volition, and the fact that she had left the package at home was really alarming. Second, he discovered Chinese money on Kate's bed. This was strange, for the parents had not the faintest idea where the woman had got it, or why she needed it. Next, a team member named Bobby Minter got involved. He specialized in collecting information about a person on the internet and tracking people down. His skills really came in handy. In no time at all, he found out that on the day of her disappearance, around 10 p.m., Kate called her friend named James, but he didn't pick up the phone. Then the woman left him a very disturbing voice message. In it, she stated that someone had stolen her credit cards. He went on to find out that her phone was last active at 1:53 a.m. She called her own voicemail box number for some reason. Bobby found out that the call was made from the James Island area, which was a few miles from Kate's house. Another member of the team, former homicide detective Eugene Frazier, also found out something interesting. He talked to several acquaintances living in James Island and found out something strange. Who had volunteered to let the police inspect his and his mother's house did not actually live there. He was renting an apartment in a building nearby. Eugene was very fortunate to learn these details. The fact is that a close acquaintance of his turned out to be the owner of the very apartment Ethan had rented. Digging deeper, the team of detectives realized that the police did not conduct any proper investigation of Ethan. They only took a cursory look at his mother's house and let it go at that. The team decided to look into the matter on their own. They discovered that Ethan had a girlfriend named Heather Camp. When they asked Kate's parents if they knew the woman, her mother recalled a rather strange story. Kate had met Heather a month before she disappeared. They were on the same train from Washington, D.C., where the woman was dealing with problems with her visa to Russia. After meeting her on the train, Heather told her that her wallet had been stolen, and now she had absolutely nothing to live on. Kate agreed to help and loaned her a certain amount of money. Heather herself said she had gotten a job as a pediatric surgeon in South Carolina and should start in the next few days. A few days later, Heather stated that her daughter had been killed in a car accident in New Jersey, and here her behavior seemed completely illogical. Heather did not go there, and from her demeanor, it seemed that her daughter's death did not upset her much. The team of detectives discovered another curious fact. An Indiana fraud case had been filed against Heather. The reason for this was that she was posing as a licensed doctor, forging the necessary documents. Thus, the team gathered an impressive set of data that forced them to look at the case from a different angle. They turned all this information over to the police, but they were totally unwilling to investigate further. So the team realized their only chance to get the cops moving was to present them with unequivocal evidence implicating Ethan and Heather in Kate's disappearance. To achieve this goal, the team went to extreme measures. First, Eugene Frazier asked an acquaintance of his, who rented Ethan's apartment, to install a hidden camera in front of the door of his apartment. What's more, they installed a hidden GPS tracker on Ethan's car. This allowed the team to track his movements and see what he was up to. It wasn't long before it paid off. After studying Ethan's itinerary, the former detectives determined that he had been to multiple pawn shops throughout the city. They followed his footsteps and learned that at each of these pawn shops, the man sold various pieces of jewelry in small batches. Alas, they were unable to find out if the jewelry belonged to Kate. But the detectives felt they were getting close to a clue. After a while, they ran into a serious problem. The owner of the apartment where Ethan and Heather were staying informed them that he was going to evict them for non-payment. The team realized that if they did so, they would lose the ability to monitor their behavior and movements. So they made every effort to convince the owner not to do so. Along with this, the detectives urgently came up with a new plan. They asked the owner to give Ethan and Heather extra time to pay their rent. But on one condition, they both had to sign an agreement under which they would undertake to repay that debt in any case. This ruse worked. As soon as the landlord gave the team this contract, they immediately sent it to the lab. Their purpose was simple: to compare Ethan and Heather's handwriting with Kate's signature on the very check for $4,000, and here they had their long-awaited breakthrough. The specialist stated with absolute certainty that the signature on the check was written by the same person who had signed Heather on the contract. This meant that it was Heather who had forged Kate's signature. But the team was well aware that the lazy police still wouldn't want to listen to them. Something else had to be found, and they came up with a new plan. They convinced the landlord to play along and tell Ethan that the apartment needed to be treated for insects. The head of the team put on an exterminator's suit and went to the apartment with the owner. Beforehand, the detectives waited until Ethan left the apartment. Noticing that his car had pulled away from the house, James and the owner went inside. An unpleasant surprise awaited them. Ethan was at home. It turned out that Heather was driving his car, but it was too late to call off the whole operation. So James had to change his plan as he went. They continued to stick to the legend of the need for disinfestation and asked Ethan to wait outside the apartment while the dangerous chemicals were sprayed. Ethan, who suspected nothing, agreed and went outside. At the same moment, James began to carefully search the apartment for any evidence that might link Ethan to Kate's disappearance. James noticed Ethan's backpack and examined its contents. There awaited his first clue: Chinese money. As we recall, the same bills were laying on Kate's bed. Alas, that wasn't the end of his luck. James was unable to find any other potential clues. He and the landlord pretended to do the processing and left. The team needed a plan again. As they studied the camera footage in front of Ethan's apartment, they noticed that one man came in very often. He turned out to be a neighbor of the couple, Terry Williams. The detective speculated that he might know about Ethan and Heather's involvement in Kate's disappearance. So the team took a risky step. They decided to offer Williams an impressive sum of cash if he would tell the police what his friends had done to Kate. They took the bag of cash and went to Williams' apartment with this offer. But here, the detectives had a rather unexpected twist waiting for them. At the time they knocked on Williams' door and told him about their offer, Heather was at his house and heard everything. Apparently, she was cheating on Ethan with Williams. After hearing the detectives talking to her lover, Heather panicked. She called Ethan and hysterically told her what had happened. The team didn't expect this scenario, and over the next few days they tried to figure out what to do next. But then another surprise happened. Williams called them and invited them to his house for a talk. The detectives arrived at his apartment and Williams spoke. He stated that Ethan and Heather had not told him anything directly. but he suspected that the couple had done something bad to Kate. He then picked up an iPod from the shelf and revealed that Heather had given it to him just days after Kate disappeared, and Williams had assumed that the player belonged to her. The team examined the iPod, and thanks to the serial number, they were able to determine that it did belong to Kate. This set of clues was already enough to once again go to the Charleston Police Department, and this time, the local cops could no longer shrug off their job. After examining everything the team had managed to dig up, they finally arrested Ethan and Heather. At the first interrogation, Heather agreed to cooperate with the investigation on the condition that the police help her get minimal punishment. She stated that Kate's body was on Wadmalaw Island, about 20 miles from her home. Police enlisted a search party and combed the area all day, but Kate's body was not there. It soon became clear that Heather had simply deceived them. Then, Andy Savage decided to resort to another ruse. He realized that Heather was most likely directly connected to Kate's murder, but he met with her and promised to help. Andy offered her a deal. He would do whatever it took to get her off the check-forging charges, and she would name the exact location of Kate's body. Heather is convinced that this is her only chance, and she agrees. She said Kate's body is still on the outskirts of Watermelon Island, specifically near Polly Point Road. The woman also described a specific location. The team of detectives decided to go there without the police. And they were disappointed. They failed to find Kate, but they returned the next day, and it finally happened. The woman's remains were found. Medical examiners were unable to determine the cause of death, but soon the perpetrators themselves began to speak. In August 2009, Heather signed a confession to murder, obstruction of justice, and bank check fraud. Police discovered that the woman had been a scam artist for years, and on that train from Washington, D.C., she chose Kate as her next victim. She later met Ethan and began dating him. As for Ethan, he was in no hurry to plead guilty, and a trial began in October 2010. Based on testimony from Heather, the prosecution reconstructed the chronology of events. According to their version, on the day of her disappearance, Kate learned that Heather had cheated her and also stolen her credit cards. Kate threatened to tell her father, who would most likely involve the police. Heather told Ethan, who sided with her, despite her long friendship with Kate. According to the investigation, Kate had dinner that night, not only with Ethan, Heather was also present. Apparently, the couple was trying to negotiate with Kate to keep the cheating story from escalating. At the restaurant, Heather might have promised Kate to return the credit cards and money that had been in Ethan's apartment. When all three got there, Heather and Ethan could abide at her time and attacked her. The court questioned Heather's version and ultimately sentenced her to 39 years in prison. As for Ethan, he was a little luckier. He was sentenced to 25 years. This difference is due to the fact that Heather was also charged with fraud. What do we have in the end? Because of the actions of one fraudster, events unfolded that could give rise to detective movies. On the one hand, we have Kate, who suffered a severe trauma as a child, affected by alcohol and other substances. She found the strength to change her life for the better and overcame her depression. On the other hand, we have a sad fact in front of us. Her whole life was cut short because of a combination of betrayal and lust for profit. Ethan Mack had been her close friend for years, and for the sake of his new lover, he took part. Her murder. There are also the police, who did not do a quality investigation. After learning that the woman had a history of problems with illegal substances, they put the case on the back burner. This is where people who had useful skills and a desire to seek justice came to the rescue. A group of independents did more than the entire police department, and it was only thanks to them that the killers were sent to jail, and Kate's family was lifted from their shoulders the heavy burden of ignorance. It is worth clarifying that not all of their methods are legal, but they did get to the truth. And what do you think? Are these mild violations justified? Is it possible to resort to surveillance and fraudulent searches to prove the involvement of a person in a murder? Write your opinion in the comments. A 19-year-old student was found dead in her own apartment during a fire, but the cause of her death was not fire at all. Detectives knew immediately that they were dealing with a murder, but they had almost no evidence. During the investigation, the police have many suspects, but only one small and seemingly insignificant detail helped them solve the mystery. The American city of Burleson, Texas. Her family lived very modestly, so in her school years she got various part-time jobs to pay for her own college education. In addition, she received good grades and was an active participant in the life of the local church. Even before her graduation, Missy decided that she wanted to become a teacher and, in 1992, she went to the University of Texas at Arlington. It was about 40 kilometers from her home and Missy decided to go to a college. Rent a place closer to campus. What's more, she took 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition without the help of her parents. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough to cover all her expenses. Once, she had to skip an entire semester to earn more money during that time to continue her studies. Sometimes, she also worked part-time as a nurse, taking care of children. Despite such a busy schedule, Missy called her mother every day when she got home. It became something of a tradition for them. Her daughter would call her and tell her that she had returned from work, even if it was already nighttime. On the evening of April 7, 1994, Missy also called her mother. They talked until about midnight. The young woman was in good spirits and preparing to celebrate her 20th birthday, which was only a few weeks away. Around 3 a.m., the local police department received a call from Missy's neighbor, who lived downstairs. She reported that there was a loud noise coming from the apartment upstairs, like broken glass and banging. She thought there might have been a robbery going on and decided to call the police. The squad arrived on the scene and a few minutes later, the fire department received a call to the same address. It turned out that there was a fire in the house, so in addition to firefighters and police officers, an ambulance also arrived there and proceeded to extinguish the fire. Given the building was small, they quickly managed to find the seat of the fire. It was the apartment on the 2nd floor where Missy lived. When they entered the apartment, they saw a terrible sight. There was the young woman lying on the bed, without any clothes on, and the fire was burning all around her. The firefighters immediately realized she was dead. So as soon as the fire was extinguished, the police arrived. They determined from the first second that the young woman had not died from the fire. They noticed several stab wounds on her body, which caused a lot of blood on the bed. As for the fire itself, firefighters immediately opined that it was purposeful arson. Moreover, when they first arrived at her apartment, they smelled a strong odor of gasoline. After examining the apartment more thoroughly, the firefighters were conclusively convinced that they were dealing with arson. Someone had poured gasoline all over the apartment and left, leaving the dead young woman inside. However, the perpetrator had closed the front door, which made the extent of the fire not as large. There was not enough oxygen in the apartment to keep the flames burning. The police quickly identified the deceased as Missy Grubhow. In the meantime, her body was handed over to medical examiners, and they conclusively confirmed that the young woman had died before the fire started. This was confirmed by the stab wounds on her body and the lack of smoke traces in her lungs. If the victim had been alive when the fire started, even when she was unconscious, she would have inhaled smoke and the experts would have noticed it. They also determined that the young woman had been abused and were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's DNA because of it. The police found a knife in Missy's apartment, which they believed was the murder weapon. Unfortunately, no prints were left on it. Apparently, the killer had washed it in the sink before setting the fire. Nor could the DNA sample from the victim's body help them get a lead on a suspect. In 1994, there was no way yet to load that data into the database to match the DNA of previous convictions, but the police had their first lead almost immediately. It turned out that a week before her death, Missy had filed a police report on a coworker she had worked with at the coffee shop. A young guy had lost his place and was looking for someone to stay with for a while, until he could find a new apartment. Of all his coworkers, Missy was the only one who agreed to help and let him stay with her. She even gave him a spare set of keys so he could leave and return regardless of her. The coworker only lived there for a few days. One day, Missy came home from work and was about to put the tips she had received for the day into the piggy bank. She kept saving small amounts to add to her tuition and rent, and by then she had almost, but that day, the young woman discovered that all her money had disappeared. She immediately blamed her coworker, since no one but him had spare keys. He denied guilt, but Missy threw him out and reported him to the police. But when they started looking for him, the guy had quit his job and disappeared. So the investigators had a pretty good suspect. The guy had keys to Missy's apartment, so he had no problem getting in. Might have held a grudge against her and decided to get revenge. If he didn't know that Missy had already gone to the police, he might kill her just to keep her from doing it. While the cops were searching for this guy, they started working on another clue. Letters from a certain young man had been found in the victim's apartment, and, judging by their contents, he and Missy were having some sort of affair. They didn't live very far apart, but they exchanged letters regularly. The young woman was a deep believer and had never had a boyfriend before. She also mentioned in her letters that she wasn't ready for any kind of intimate relationship until after marriage, and her companion was of the same opinion at first. But over time, the contents of his letters became increasingly intimate, and Missy wasn't happy about it. The detectives decided to run the man through the database and, to their surprise, discovered that he had a prior conviction for violent acts. Given that Missy had also been abused before the murder, this was enough to make the young man a suspect. He was found and questioned, but he denied any involvement, but he had no solid alibi. The boy said he was sleeping alone in his house at the time of the murder. However, Missy was killed between midnight and 3 a.m., so his alibi didn't seem all that dubious, but the detectives were in no hurry to drop the charges and asked him to volunteer a DNA sample. The guy agreed, and they let him go. Unfortunately, in those years, DNA analysis took more than a month, and it had only been a few days since Missy's murder. So detectives had to wait at least a month for experts to isolate the DNA profile from the victim's body, and then wait another month to compare it to the guy's sample. So investigators began looking for other leads, and soon they had a third suspect. The management of the cafe where Missy worked told them about an incident that had happened shortly before her death. The young woman complained to the manager that one of her co-workers, named Jeff, had stolen some items or money from the cash register. The theft charges were confirmed and the man was fired. Afterwards, he caught up with Missy and began accusing her of losing his job and leaving him without a livelihood. During this conversation, he said he was going to kill her. The police also discovered that Missy had been killed. That Jeff had tried to win Missy's affections, but she rejected him. This also may have served as an additional motive. All this was more than enough for the police to question the man. But while the detectives were trying to find out his address, something unexpected happened. Jeff's girlfriend came into the station and said she was afraid of her boyfriend and suspected him of killing Missy. It turned out that the man had not been home the night of the murder, and he had never told his girlfriend where he was since then. She also said that Jeff had a very bad temper and often exhibited outbursts of aggression. The man repeatedly mentioned the story that he had been fired because of a complaint from Missy, and he had been furious about what she had done. When he did get found and brought in for questioning, he acted very brazen. Jeff kept smiling and bombarded the detectives with various stories that were odds with reality. He claimed that in fact Missy was obsessed with him and wanted to date him, and that was why his girlfriend had gone to the police to get revenge. He also stated that he was at home with his girlfriend the night of the murder, which contradicted her story. When the detective said that his girlfriend denied this alibi, he just laughed. That said, Jeff did agree to provide his DNA sample voluntarily. Given that there is no evidence against him and the DNA analysis could have taken over a month, he had to be released. But a few days later, Jeff's girlfriend called the police. She was extremely disturbed and told them that the guy had kidnapped her from her parents' house and held her hostage for 8 hours, threatening to kill her if she tried to get away from him. Eventually, he let her go, and the young woman immediately contacted the police. They immediately began to search for Jeff, but by then, he had already escaped. In spite of this, the detectives were almost certain that he was behind Missy's murder. They put out a search for him on a kidnapping charge, but the man seemed to have vanished. Experts at the lab were able to determine the blood type of the owner of the DNA sample found on the victim's body. They also had samples from Jeff and Missy's boyfriend, and both had a different blood type. This came as a surprise to the detectives. They were almost certain that Jeff was the killer, but the data from the lab disproved that theory. Thus, they were left with only one suspect who had not given his DNA sample and who had not yet been found, who she had allowed to stay with her. However, a month had passed since the murder, and the police were still unable to track him down. But suddenly, they had a new lead no one was expecting. Misty's mother called the investigators and said she remembered a strange detail the young woman had told her on the phone a few days before she died. She didn't give it much thought and didn't decide to share it with the police until a month later. As mentioned earlier, Missy sometimes worked as a nanny, and one of her regular clients was a young couple who lived in the same complex. They had a young child, and the woman was pregnant with her second. Her partner, Luis Arroyo, also worked in the same restaurant as Missy, so they often saw each other and talked. According to the mother's story, a few days before her daughter's death, the man came to Missy's house to talk. Even though it was getting close to nightfall, she let him in. Luis told her that his relationship with the young woman had been strained lately and that he just needed someone to talk to. But what followed was something that struck the police as extremely strange. Missy told her mother that after the conversation, they got into a mock pillow fight. It was hard for detectives to imagine a 32-year-old man and father coming to a 19-year-old young woman's house near midnight and then having a pillow fight. That's exactly what happened. In a conversation with her mother, she didn't give it much thought, but the police decided to check on the man. They found out that Luis had no criminal history, had served in the army, and was a model employee at the restaurant. But after talking to his co-workers, the detectives learned a very interesting fact. Of course, after Missy's murder, the restaurant employees were constantly discussing the subject, and one day Luis said, "I hope they catch whoever killed and raped Missy as soon as possible." A little later he added that they might never find the culprit because all the evidence was burned in the fire. The problem was this. The police never disclosed that the victim had been abused before she died. It wasn't in the newspapers or reports. It wasn't even reported to her mother. So the detectives had a logical question. How did Luis know about it? When questioned, the man stated that he and Missy did talk a lot, but that he had nothing to do with her murder. He was calm and forthright in answering all of the police questions until the detectives asked him for a DNA sample, at which point Luis became visibly nervous. He asked why they needed his DNA, since the fire was supposed to destroy all traces of the perpetrator and his sample would have nothing to compare it to. You have to agree, that sounds pretty strange. It is worth noting that the police also did not disclose the fact that the experts received a sample of the killer's DNA. Therefore, no one knew whether they had this evidence or not. After these words, the detectives explained to Luis that they had a sample of the killer's DNA and the man's behavior changed dramatically. He said he urgently needed to take his child somewhere and left the station, promising to come back the next day to take the DNA test. But he never came. A day later, the police went to his workplace, but the man was no longer there. The manager said his girlfriend called and asked to give Luis a couple of days off because he had to leave town. Along with this, the detectives discovered another interesting fact. Luis had married his girlfriend the day after he was questioned. At this point, they could only guess what was behind the move. But first, the investigators decided to talk to his wife. She said that on the day of the murder, Luis called her from work and said he was going to a bar with friends. He came home around midnight, took a shower and said he was going for a run. He returned after 2 a.m. and his wife noticed that he smelled strongly of smoke and gasoline. The man was also coughing constantly and his nose had traces of soot in it. His wife asked him what had happened. Luis then told her that he had run by Missy's house and noticed the fire. Went up to her apartment and saw that the place was engulfed in flames and the young woman herself was lying on the bed. Luis tried to save her by giving her artificial respiration, but the smoke and flames forced him to run outside. Apparently, his wife was quite satisfied with the story, and they went to bed. As you have already realized, the detectives found a number of suspicious points in the story. Even setting aside the fact that the man decided to go for a run, his further story defies any logic. First, how could he have gotten into Missy's apartment without keys? After the fire, forensics determined that there were no signs of forced entry on the door. This means that Missy let her killer in on her own, and according to Luis's story, he entered her apartment when she was already dead. Second, if his story is to be believed, he had just seen a dead young woman. Had known for a year and a full-blown fire in the house next door, but instead of calling the fire department and the police, he decided to just go to bed. His wife apparently didn't see fit to do anything about the situation either. The police also learned Luis's blood type from his wife. It matched the blood type found on the victim's body. All of the above was enough to put a man on the wanted list, but his whereabouts remained unknown. The wife also asserted that she didn't know where her husband had gone, but the detectives didn't believe her. By then, they suspected that the woman was deliberately covering for Luis. In their opinion, he had told her a greatly altered story about the murder in which he had no choice or Missy had attacked him herself. In other words, he had convinced her under some false pretenses not to cooperate with the police. Had been abused before she died. Almost immediately thereafter, Lewis's wife told them where he might be. At about the same time, police officers from the city of San Antonio found a burnt-out car that belonged to Lewis and that his mother lived in the same city. Detectives went there and found the man himself, after which he was arrested. At the station, he acted extremely tense, lying on the floor, crying, and generally like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But during his interrogation, Lewis stated that he had indeed gone to Missy's apartment that night and had been intimate with her in a consensual manner. This account did not go well with the fact that the young woman's body was found with many wounds and bruises, not to mention the fire. Next, Lewis's story became frankly bizarre. He said he didn't remember how events unfolded after that, but he may have stabbed her, and while denying that he had set the apartment on fire. The man did not actually deny his involvement in the murder, but he did not confess either. This made the detectives' job difficult, but now they could take a sample of his DNA. At that point, they already knew that Lewis's blood type matched the killer's, and all they had to do was wait for the DNA results. Some time later, the experts found a perfect match, and Lewis was charged with murder. Given that he did not actually confess directly, the case went to trial. The man continued to insist that he and Missy had a consensual intimate relationship that night. As for the murder, he continued to give some vague version. Lewis supposedly had no recollection of stabbing her, but did seem to recall taking a knife from the kitchen. He said the same thing about the fire. He remembered that there was a fire in the room, but he did not start it himself. According to the investigation, Lewis had long had a liking for Missy, and in some ways was even obsessed with her. In favor of this one interesting fact, the man had worked in the same restaurant as Missy for almost a year, and he had moved into her compound 6 months before the murder. Considering that there were hundreds of similar complexes in their city, it would be logical to assume that Lewis had chosen this particular place for the sake of living closer to Missy. In the days before the murder, he had visited her around midnight for no meaningful reason, which also seemed odd to the investigators. According to their version, on the night of the murder, Lewis had gone to her apartment for the purpose of inducing Missy to have intimate contact. The young woman, who was a virgin at the time and was saving herself for marriage, rebuffed him and Lewis flew into a rage. He abused her, then killed her, and went to get gasoline. After setting the apartment on fire, he returned home and told his wife some made-up story in which he made up what had happened as an accident. Perhaps the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy came about only after investigators began to suspect Lewis and informed him that the fire had not destroyed the killer's DNA. Upon learning this, Lewis could have convinced his wife to tell the police how he had tried to save the young woman with CPR. Apparently, his wife really didn't know the truth. She was also not charged in any way. Detectives speculated that Lewis had married her, only that she would be legally entitled not to testify against him. As for Lewis himself, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of petitioning for parole in 2034. Apparently, he had hoped for a reduced sentence, recounting his memory loss that night and not directly denying that he could have killed Missy. But the court concluded that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out, to kill Missy to avoid prison. Thus, the police were able to solve a very complicated case in which, of the 4 suspects, the most unobvious was the culprit. They only drew attention to him thanks to Missy's mother, who decided to share a strange but insignificant detail. If it weren't for that little detail. And lastly, as for Jeff, he was found after all, and jailed for 4 years for kidnapping his own girlfriend. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like if you liked the video. A freshman at a prestigious university disappeared without a trace after a sports match, leaving her open car and keys in the parking lot. The police did not investigate the case, thinking that the young woman had simply run away, but her parents and friends knew that something terrible had happened. For 12 years the mystery remained unsolved, and only after all this time did the truth come out. Shannon Melendi was born on October 20th, 1974, in Miami, USA. 5 years later, her parents had a second daughter, Monique. From an early age, the girls were taught that their first priority should be to get a quality education. This approach has had a strong influence on Shannon. From the first years of school, she studied only on the excellent, while finding time for various clubs and sections, where she was also ahead of her classmates in all respects. In high school, the young woman firmly decided that she wanted to tie her future career with politics or law. She headed the school debate club, and in her last year of school she even made a speech to the U.S. Congress and the General Assembly of the United Nations as part of special training programs. It was after these events that she finally decided she wanted to work on the Supreme Court. To achieve this goal, she needed a good legal education. And Shannon sent applications to several of the country's top universities. Given her impeccable grades and accomplishments in extracurricular activities, all universities and colleges were willing to accept her, but she chose Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. In addition to the fact that it was one of the top 20 universities in the country, the young woman was offered an annual grant of $15,000 for the first 4 years of study. That way she could cover most of her tuition. After graduation, she moved to Atlanta to study political science. The university made a great impression on her. She quickly settled in and made many friends. Despite the grant that Shannon received, she also got a part-time job. A few kilometers from her dorm was a softball field that needed employees. Her duties included keeping an eye on the score of the game. On March 26, 1994, Shannon had to quit her job because of an error by her supervisor. That morning another employee was supposed to keep score, but the young woman was accidentally added to the schedule and agreed to work the game. Shannon arrived at the stadium at about 8:40, and 4 hours later her shift was over. Usually after work the young woman would stop at a gas station nearby to buy a soda. That day she left as well. Only no one saw her again. The stadium management expected her to return after halftime to turn in her scorecard, but she never did. Her friend and roommate, Athena, was the first to sound the alarm. At first she was alarmed when Shannon didn't return to her dorm in the evening. She had nowhere else to sleep and was unlikely to stay with anyone. After not waiting for her roommate the next morning, she decided to call her parents to see if she had contacted them in the last 24 hours. Shannon's parents were at work at the time, so her younger sister came to the phone. She told Athena that she hadn't spoken to Shannon in the past few days and promised to ask her parents when they got home. Athena became increasingly worried and told 2 mutual friends about the young woman's disappearance. Then they decided to look for her on their own. They got in their car and started to drive around the campus. Eventually they reached the stadium where Shannon worked, and there, a disturbing discovery awaited them. As they approached, they noticed a gas station near the stadium and, to their surprise, spotted Shannon's car there. It was a black Nissan 280SX that her parents had given her. As they pulled up to the gas station, the friends found the car empty, but the keys were in the ignition and the doors were unlocked. All this only increased their anxiety. Shannon would never leave her car, much less with the keys and the doors open. Ever since her parents had given her this car, she had cared for it reverently. Realizing that something terrible might have happened to the young woman, her friends called the police. Only the officers who arrived on the scene treated the situation as irresponsible as possible. They took a cursory look at the car and concluded that there is no evidence of a possible crime. There was no blood or signs of struggle in the car. So the officers simply advised their friends not to worry. They didn't even take fingerprints off the steering wheel and doors. Moreover, they asked Athena to take the car to the university parking lot, which she did. The officers talked to the gas station attendants and they confirmed that they had seen Shannon around noon yesterday. They also did not notice anything suspicious. Ultimately, the official police version was that, given there was no signs of blood or struggle in the car, Shannon had probably just run away somewhere. Given that she was 19 years old at the time, no one was going to seriously investigate the case. That evening, Shannon's parents decided to go immediately to Atlanta to participate in the search. Upon learning that the police were unwilling to investigate their daughter's disappearance, they did everything they could to change that, and in many ways it worked, thanks to Shannon herself. After she spoke to Congress, the young woman was accepted into a nonprofit organization by Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States. Shannon's parents brought it to his attention that their daughter was missing, and he, along with Senator Bob Graham, secured FBI involvement in the case. The parents flew to Atlanta and began a search for their daughter. Along with other students, they printed and posted thousands of flyers about Shannon's disappearance, and, a little later, her father rented a billboard. Along with this, he announced a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find the young woman. Detectives identified several suspects among Shannon's acquaintances, but quickly became convinced of their innocence. 3 days after the young woman disappeared, something interesting happened. An unidentified man called the police on the hotline number listed on the flyers about Shannon's disappearance. He stated that the reporters had made a mistake in reporting on the young woman's disappearance. They said that Shannon was wearing green shorts the day she disappeared, but that they were actually blue. Further, the caller stated that he had Shannon and was going to hold her as long as he wanted. There is one very confusing point with this call, and that is, why wasn't it given any weight? Despite the caller saying that he had kidnapped Shannon, law enforcement continued to believe that the young woman had run off somewhere. This went on for several more days until an unidentified man made a second call on April 6th. This time he called the university's counseling center and said that Shannon was at his place and that she was fine. He promised to call later to make demands for her return. Finally, he said he would leave Shannon's ring for the police near where he was calling from to confirm his words. This time the FBI quickly traced the call and found that it was made from a payphone located near a Burger King restaurant in suburban Atlanta. Upon arriving at the location, detectives did find the ring there in a cloth baggie that was wrapped in duct tape. Shannon's parents confirmed that the ring did indeed belong to her. For them, this news was a relief in the first place because they got a chance to see their daughter alive again. Since then, they have been waiting for the perpetrator to call again and make his demands. This event also led to law enforcement finally reclassifying the disappearance case as a kidnapping. The police department appointed a new lead detective, and he immediately noted the unprofessionalism of his predecessors. According to him, almost all of their actions were flawed. They did not take fingerprints from Shannon's car, instead asking a stranger to drive and then drive the car to another location. They also did little or nothing to investigate the case, since they thought the young woman had simply run off somewhere and would be back soon. With all this in mind, investigators decided to work every possible lead from scratch, and the first thing they focused on was the softball field where Shannon was last seen the day she disappeared. Several weeks had passed since the young woman had gone missing. In addition, there was a championship game on the field that day, which brought the total number of visitors and participants to over several hundred. The detectives attempted to question as many people as possible, urging them to recall any suspicious moments at the game. To their surprise, many told the same story. The only oddity at that game was the behavior of the referee. According to the players and stadium staff, he was extremely dismissive of his job. He was distracted all the time, including during key events. Instead of doing his job, he was constantly trying to talk to Shannon and ask her out. The judge's name was Colden Hinton, but he himself preferred to use the nickname Butch. The 33-year-old man worked as a mechanic for the local Delta Airlines while refereeing matches was his hobby. He had a wife, taught Sunday school at the church, and seemed quite harmless. The detectives began to dig deeper and discovered that Butch had left the softball field at almost the same time as Shannon. After talking to his coworkers, they found out another strange thing. The day before the game, he had asked the other umpires to fill in for him at that game because he was supposed to have a date that day. They all knew that Butch was married, but he stated that his wife was out of town for a few days. When all his coworkers said no, he called his boss and asked him to leave the game early. The man explained that his brother's wife was in the hospital and they had no one to leave the children with. Except that day, Butch returned to the stadium 2 hours after he had left and was still wearing his officiating uniform. He went into the locker room, changed and left. 3 hours later he returned to the stadium where he was spotted by a colleague. Butch said he had forgotten to give his paycheck to the accounting department, but he didn't have his paycheck with him. Moreover, Butch asked his colleague if he had seen where his car was parked. For a man who had just arrived at the stadium, that question sounded very strange. Investigators questioned Butch, and he denied any involvement in the young woman's disappearance. According to him, after the club, he went straight home. As proof, he showed detectives several outgoing calls from his phone made less than 40 minutes after leaving the stadium. He was offered a polygraph interview. Butch agreed and failed it. Almost all of the answers were deemed false. It wasn't enough to arrest him. It was, however, enough to obtain a search warrant for his house, which, incidentally, was located near the burger joint where the police found the Shannon ring. Detectives discovered two other curious facts, which his neighbor said that he had lit a fire in the early morning hours after the day Shannon disappeared. Later, the man called his father and asked him for a handsaw, stating that a tree had fallen on his car. Detectives went to his house with their service dogs, but they were unable to find any sign of Shannon's presence there, but an interesting discovery awaited them on the property. They noticed 3 places with overgrown soil. When they dug them up, they found something really creepy. Under the ground were dozens of items of women's clothing and shoes, as well as a sleeping bag and some softball field scorecards. Showed pictures to Shannon's parents and concluded that none of it belonged to the young woman. Butch himself said he had no idea where on his property such hiding places came from. He assumed it was all left over from the past owners of the house. In the end, the police were in a tricky situation. A lot of facts pointed to Butch's involvement in Shannon's disappearance, but at the same time there was not a single direct clue against him. They hoped that a more detailed examination of the young woman's car would bear fruit, but here too, they were out of luck. Because the police did not take fingerprints and look for DNA samples on the first day of the investigation, the experts were not able to find them. But they came to an interesting conclusion. Someone had thoroughly wiped down the car, destroying any potential traces. In an effort to find some hard evidence against Butch, one of the detectives dug up a really interesting fact. He examined the bag containing the Shannon ring and discovered that such items are not manufactured for retail sale. He contacted the manufacturer and learned that the only buyer of such bags in the state of Georgia was Delta Airlines. The company itself stated that the bags were used by mechanics to store small airplane parts. And as we recall, Butch worked as a mechanic for that very company. And that's not all. The detectives went over the whole thing so thoroughly that they found another tiny clue. In Butch's car, they found a piece of the same duct tape in which the pouch had been wrapped. On the tape itself, the experts found microscopic particles of the same metal. After studying its composition, they concluded that this compound is used only in the aviation industry. The case was frozen for many months. The police and Shannon's parents were sure that Butch was behind the young woman's disappearance, but no one could prove his involvement. All the evidence was circumstantial. As soon as the airline learned of the suspicions about the man, they quickly fired him. Before that, he had managed to brag, mockingly to his colleagues, that he was a suspect in a case of kidnapping a woman. After reviewing his background, investigators discovered that Butch had quite an impressive criminal history under his belt. They didn't know this at the beginning of the investigation because there was no advanced criminal databases back in the 90s. It turned out that he had committed his first crime when he was still a minor. He got a part-time job and one day went to his boss's house where only his wife was there. Butch tried to tie her up, but he failed. The woman then convinced him that if he left, she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened. He believed her and left the house, and the woman immediately called the police. Butch was arrested, but due to his age, he was only ordered to undergo involuntary psychiatric treatment. This, despite the fact that he admitted that he wanted to abuse the woman. The next time he went to the police was for kidnapping a 14-year-old young woman when he was in his 20s and had a wife. He called his younger brother's ex-girlfriend and told her he wanted to meet her. He assured her that his younger brother would be with him, except he came alone to the meeting. Then Butch said that his brother asked him to give her a gift. He asked her to put her hands together, then wrapped a rope around them and took the young woman to his house, where he locked her in the basement. It is unknown how the story might have ended, but Butch's wife accidentally discovered the victim and called the police. That Butch molested her, but despite this, he was only sentenced to 4 years in prison. The victim also shared some very disturbing information. Butch told her that if she didn't comply with him, he would do to her what he had done to the previous 2, whatever that meant. Released early, less than 2 years later, he remarried. His new wife was unaware of Butch's criminal past. The police believed these were far from all of Butch's crimes. Buried women's clothing indicated that he may have had other victims that he did not leave alive. Shannon's investigators were never able to get any charges against Butch in the case, so they continued to look for any potential evidence, but to no avail. In December 2003, Butch was released early from prison after spending 8.5 years there. In all that time, the police could not come close to charging him with kidnapping Shannon. but they were somewhat lucky. While in prison, Butch frequently hinted to other inmates about his involvement in the case, and many of them agreed to testify against him. Detectives interviewed about 10 inmates. One of them, Adonis Cornwell, said he woke up in the middle of the night to a scream from his cellmate, Butch. He said in tears that he had not killed Shannon. The demons inside him had done it for him. He asked the other inmates what the chances were of going to prison for murder if the victim's body was never found. To one of the inmates, he almost confessed what he had done. Butch told him that he had left the softball field with Shannon and that the police had been extremely stupid for not examining her car properly. He also said that her body would never be found because it had been scattered in the wind. This testimony, combined with all the previous circumstantial evidence, gave investigators a chance to bring the case to trial. 6 months later, in August 2004, they finally arrested Butch for the first time on charges of kidnapping and murder. According to the investigation, Butch saw Shannon at a gas station and under some pretext lured her into his car. Next, he threatened her to drive to his house or he drove himself. Given that his past known crimes have been committed with knives, it could have been the same in Shannon's case. He then locked her in the house and drove back to the stadium, parking the young woman's car at the gas station. He left the keys in the ignition, wiped off all prints and left. When he returned home, he could have abused the young woman, killed her and then disposed of the body. Few people believe the court would convict. I think everyone is familiar with the phrase, nobody. No case, and in the vast majority of cases, it fully reflects reality. It is extremely difficult to prove that a person committed a murder. If no one has even seen the victim's body at the time, there was not a single case in Georgia where a court had convinced a person without a body, but investigators went to great lengths to squeeze the most out of the circumstantial evidence they had. They even brought in prisoners to the trial, who had heard hints of Shannon's murder from Butch. He himself insisted on his innocence, and after the trial was over, the jury could not decide on a verdict for 3 whole days, but eventually they made the decision and found Butch guilty of murder. Consequently, the court sentenced him to life in prison. He was 43 years old at the time, and in theory he should have spent the rest of his life behind bars, but there was one unpleasant nuance. The perpetrator was eligible to apply for parole every 7 years, according to the statutes in effect at the time of the murder. Butch tried to challenge the court's decision, but he failed, and 2 years later, in 2006, something really unexpected happened. He decided to confess to the murder. His story was almost exactly the same as the prosecution's. He saw Shannon in the parking lot and suggested she go to Burger King for a bite to eat. Shannon agreed and they drove there in his car. After eating lunch, they drove back to the field. Only Butch missed the right turn, stopped the car and said his leg was cramped. He asked Shannon to drive and got in the back seat. There he pulled out a prepared knife and threatened to force the young woman to drive to his house. There he tied her up and told her he wasn't going to hurt her. Butch said he only wanted to sell her car, after which he intended to let her go. She behaved calmly and did not try to scream or fight back. Leaving her tied up in the house, Butch returned to the stadium, drove Shannon's car to the gas station and left the keys inside. He did this in the hope that someone would steal it and it would help throw the police off the scent. After thoroughly wiping the steering wheel and other places where he might have left fingerprints, Butch returned home, abused the young woman and left for the movie theater with his nephews and their parents. This family outing he had originally planned as an alibi. When he returned home, he abused Shannon again while constantly repeating that he would let her go as soon as he sold her car. He then allegedly began to realize the gravity of what he had done and tried to figure out what to do next. He went to bed, but woke up a few hours later and began to panic. Then he went down to Shannon's house, put a tie around her neck and cut her off. According to Butch, she was asleep at the time and it all happened very quickly. Next, he spent hours wondering what to do with the body. By morning he decided to burn it, built a large fire and added fuel. Putting the body there, he changed his clothes and went to the service at church. When he returned home, the fire had allegedly destroyed all remains. The man said that the unbearable weight of the guilt made him confess to what he had done. But it was hard to believe. First, he made 2 taunting calls to the police and the university, telling them that Shannon was alive while he had already disposed of her body. Second, he planned to kidnap another woman, his wife's best friend, that day. As soon as his wife went out of town, he called her and asked her to come over. Allegedly, he and his wife wanted to meet her, but the friend refused, which saved her life. Knowing this, can we speak of any remorse and guilt on the part of Butch? In addition, he stated that the fire had turned the body to ashes in a matter of hours, which seems impossible. According to the man, when he came home from church, there is no trace of Shannon. He allegedly waited for the ashes to cool, gathered up the ashes, and dumped them on the railroad tracks. Most likely he lied, and had to bury the remains, including the bones, somewhere. But why would he do that? The only option here was that Butch realized he might never be released and decided to play the remorse game. But if he had pointed out where the body had been buried, his sentence might have been altered and denied him the opportunity to petition for release. He continued to insist that the fire in his house was really caused by a broken vacuum cleaner, despite the traces of fuel that experts found. As of now, he is still in prison and his next petition for parole can be filed in 2025, when he will be 64 years old. Shannon's parents continue to fight to ensure that he is never released. The only question that nausea investigators to this day is whose belongings were buried in Butch's backyard. Was he involved in the deaths of other young women which could number in the dozens? Share your thoughts of this story in the comments. It took 25 years to unravel this eerie story. An American university student walked out of a party and disappeared without a trace. From the early days, the police had a suspect but could not prove his guilt. It wasn't until decades later that the author of this podcast unearthed the gruesome details of the case, brought it to the attention of millions of people, and forced the police to reopen the investigation. Kristen Smart was born February 20th, 1977, in Augsburg, Germany, but moved to the United States with her parents, brother, and sister at an early age. The family settled in Stockton, California. Her parents worked as teachers for the children of U.S. military personnel. After graduating from high school in 1996, Kristen entered California Polytechnic University. In her spare time, she worked as a lifeguard at the recreation center on campus. On May 25, 1996, there was a big birthday party for one of the students at the fraternity house. Kristen had planned to go, but her friends declined the idea. So she went to the fraternity house alone. That party was held in typical American student style. A large group drank alcohol, listened to music, and had a good time. That night, Kristen drank too much alcohol. Felt bad and around 2 a.m. went to her dorm, but she could hardly walk by herself. When two other students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, spotted her on the street and decided to walk her home, they had both been present at the party. After a while they were joined by another student who had also attended the party, Paul Flores. He offered to walk Kristen to her dorm since he himself lived the closest. Who had to go in the other direction, said goodbye to them and left. No one had seen Kristen alive since then. At first, her disappearance was not given much thought. Christine's roommate, Margarita Campos, was the first to become concerned. She was sure her friend would return home after the party, but she never did. Adding to the anxiety was the fact that all of Christine's belongings, including her passport, wallet, and bank card, remained in her room. That meant she couldn't just pick up and go somewhere. Marguerite did not contact campus police until 2 days after the young woman disappeared. Apparently, she had hoped to the last minute that Kristen was okay and would return home. But campus police didn't take her roommate's statement seriously. It was the weekend before, and it was also the U.S. National Day of Remembrance, which commemorates fallen American servicemen. The local police simply assumed that Kristen had gone home. They were not confused by the fact that she had left all of her important belongings and documents in the dormitory. On a separate note, it was a 7-hour drive from the university campus to Christine's hometown. Too long a distance to suddenly make such a journey without money and documents, especially in the middle of the night. A few days later, the local police decided to go to work after all and called the young woman's parents. Christine's mother reported that her had not come home in a long time and had not called her in recent days. That call made the mother worried and the parents went to the police, but even though the police were not eager to open an investigation. They said that not much time had passed since Christine's disappearance and she might well have been out with friends, and it wasn't until the 4th day after she went missing that the search began. But the search yielded no results. The first thing the police interviewed was Paul Flores, who had volunteered to walk Kristen to her dormitory door and was supposed to be the last person to see her. He told detectives that he and Shri Kristen walked to her dormitory, then said goodbye, and she went to her house alone. He then allegedly went straight to bed. But this story quickly became inconsistent. Paul's dorm mates saw him go to the shower around 5 a.m., while he and Kristen parted ways after 2 a.m. In addition, the young man had a black eye and scratches on his knees. When asked by several people, he told 3 different stories about where he got all these injuries. Paul Flores seemed highly suspicious, but there was no direct evidence against him. A month had passed since Christine's disappearance, and police had expanded the search for the young woman to her hometown, catching the similarity of the story to the plot of the popular TV series Twin Peaks. The news even mentioned certain psychics who had already solved the case. According to their version, the young woman was killed by 2 men on campus and then driven to the cliff and thrown into the water. Of course, these allegations yield nothing to the police. A year after Christine's disappearance, her parents sued Flores, accusing him of complicity in the young woman's disappearance. In 1997, Paul testified under oath, but of all the questions he answered, only one, when asked to give his name. On all other occasions, he invoked the Fifth Amendment, which allows a defendant not to testify against himself. Paul's parents then sued Christine's family for moral damages, but both of these lawsuits went nowhere. The police had no evidence to prosecute Paul. On May 25, 2002, the 6th anniversary of Christine's disappearance, authorities officially declared her dead. In all that time, they also failed to come any closer to solving the case. This went on until 2018, when a California resident, Chris Lambert, decided to start his own podcast series on various crimes. He was 8 years old at the time of Christine's disappearance, and he remembered the creepy story well from the news. 22 years later, he decided to do his own investigation and was struck by how neglectful the police had been all along. The first thing Chris did was to talk to all the witnesses to those events. He learned from university students that Paul Flores had a bad reputation. The young man had repeatedly molested female students, but it never came to official complaints. Chris further analyzed the actions of the police and came to the conclusion that they had made a number of critical errors. The detectives did not arrive at the home of Paul's father, Ruben Flores, until 2 months after the young woman had disappeared. Given that Paul was living with his father, the police should have investigated the residence immediately, but when the police did arrive to search it, they were extremely sloppy. The detectives did not bring a forensic specialist or a police dog trained on the smell of decomposition. Because of this, the search was essentially useless. The detectives also failed to examine the 2 cars of the Flores family, one of which Paul may have used to drive Kristen from the campus to her father's house. Several months after the police visit, one of the cars was sold and the other was allegedly stolen. The police never showed up at Paul's mother's house, and that was where one of the main clues was hiding. Chris Lambert discovered that 4 months after Kristen Smart disappeared, a woman named Mary Lassiter had rented Paul's mother's house. In one of the rooms, she discovered a necklace linked very similar to the one Kristen was wearing. This necklace was also in the pictures posted all over the city. She immediately took the evidence to the police, but they refused to accept it as evidence and then lost it altogether. Chris found out that the backyard of Paul's mother's house had always been concreted, but shortly after the young woman disappeared, a small piece of concrete was cut out. A flower bed had been planted in that spot. Mary Lassiter told Lambert a very eerie story. Every day since moving in, Mary had heard sounds coming from that very flower bed. Every day at the same time, at 4:20 in the morning, and at 4:20 in the afternoon. She would hear the sound very much like a wristwatch alarm. Soon the sound stopped. Most likely the watch's battery died. With this story, Chris went to Christine's mother. Ms. Smart told him that her daughter did set the alarm for 4:20 in the morning, since she had to be at work at the recreation center at 5. Lambert's podcast aired in 2019. Millions of listeners came away outraged at what they had heard. They were struck by the negligence and inaction of the police. The evidence Chris found further shocked listeners. Despite much circumstantial evidence, Paul Flores is still at large. Public pressure led the police department to reopen the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance. The first thing investigators did was search the Flores family's homes, and vehicles were seized. Forensic investigators finally dug up that ill-fated flower bed, but no body was found there. Despite the fact that there was no body, the experts managed to establish that there were traces of decomposition of the human body in the ground. On April 13, 2021, Paul Flores and his father were arrested. Paul was charged with Christine's murder, and his father was charged as an accomplice. According to the investigation, Paul began molesting the young woman after Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson left, but was rebuffed. This could explain the injuries on Flores' body. After the fight, Paul could have killed Kristen and then taken her body to his house. Seeing what his son had done, Flores' father decided to help him hide the corpse. Together they took the young woman to her mother's house and buried her in the backyard, which was later replaced with a flower bed. Sometime later, apparently afraid of police harassment, the suspects dug up the grave and took the remains to an unknown destination. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder by a Monterey County jury and faces 25 years to life in prison. His father, Ruben Flores, was charged as an accessory to the crime. He faces up to 3 years in prison. Christine's parents issued a proclamation thanking Chris Lambert and all concerned people for their family's grief that even after many years of their daughter's disappearance, this case is finally solved. Didn't Flores' mother have any idea her son's crime had been committed? The flower bed that was unexpectedly planted in the backyard didn't raise any suspicions in her mind? Or maybe she had known all along what had happened that night, but out of love for her son, she had chosen to keep quiet. Of course, some questions would remain unanswered, but that didn't matter now. Perhaps one day the young woman's remains will be found, and Kristen Smart will find peace. Share your opinion on the case in the comments. Also, if you liked the video, you can support it with a like. A 17-year-old young woman and her friend went on a trip to Australia and at one point disappeared without a trace. Despite an extensive search and many witnesses, her fate remained unknown for 18 years. When this terrible mystery was finally solved, one shocking fact surfaced. The police had everything they needed to close the case in a matter of days, but their negligence stretched it into nearly 2 decades. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Haley Dodd. Haley Dodd was born on November 30th, 1981 in England. When the girl was young, her parents, along with other children, moved to Australia, settling in the small town at Mandurah. The young woman was an excellent student, played sports, and planned to go to study to be a veterinarian or a school teacher. But before finally deciding on a choice of future profession, she wanted to travel around Australia. Graduating high school in 1999, at the age of 17, she set off on a trip to Western Australia with her best friend, Lisa. Their plan wasn't just to drive through local towns and attractions, but to spend a few months away from home. The young women were going to look for temporary jobs along the way to cover their living, food, and travel expenses. They planned a hitchhike between didn't sound like such a dangerous idea. At the time, there had been a number of murders of young women hitchhiking in the country, but compared to the overall number of people hitchhiking safely, these crimes did not cause any mass fear. However, Haley feared that her parents would not allow her to travel that way, even in the company of a friend. For this reason, she assured them that she planned to travel by bus. At the end of July, she and Lisa traveled to a town called Dungera. There they were going to work as day laborers on a local farm. They were staying at a camping site where they could get a place to sleep for a small fee. Such places are in high demand in Australia, mainly because of their cheapness. A few days before going to work, Haley decided to use the remaining free time and go to a farm to family friends, which was 200 kilometers away. She decided to hitchhike to it and Lisa didn't want to let her go alone. But Haley insisted she had nothing to worry about and would be back in a few days. To say goodbye, Lisa gave her folding knife for self-defense and some change so Haley could call her from the phone booth. After saying goodbye, she hit the road at about 8 a.m. Family friends at the farm awaited her arrival, but Haley never showed up. Worried, they called her mother and informed her. The woman feared something might have happened to her daughter, so she immediately called the police. The first thing she did was to dial an emergency number and describe the situation. After listening to her story, the operator thought that nothing urgent had happened, so she advised her to go to the local police department and file a missing person report. So she did. The detectives began their search for Haley, beginning to reconstruct the chronology of events. The first thing they did was arrive at the campsite where Lisa was staying. She was mortified at the news that her friend had never made it to the farm, but the young woman was able to give the police a comprehensive introduction. She accurately described all the clothes Haley was wearing that day, and even drew a sketch of the earrings she was wearing for the police. Haley had bought these earrings a few days before the incident. She and Lisa had gone to the store to treat themselves to some inexpensive items, and the young woman was attracted to this jewelry. At that time, she couldn't have imagined that those earrings would be the key to solving this terrible mystery of her disappearance. Detectives disseminated information about the missing young woman along with her description. Haley looked much younger. She was 152 centimeters tall and weighed just over 40 pounds. The police were able to locate the first witness fairly quickly. It turned out to be the truck driver who had given her a ride that day. According to the man's story, she had knocked on his cab window at a gas station and asked for a ride to Mora, a town near where there was a farm. The trucker was on his way to another town, but he agreed to give her a ride most of the way. The man dropped her off at a turnoff about 50 kilometers from Mora, near the town of Bajanjara, where she was to turn off the main road and onto a country road. According to the trucker, Haley was in high spirits, chatting with him the whole way and talking about her journey. After she said she was almost out of money, he gave her $15 so the young woman could buy something to eat. The man also left her his number in case she hitchhiked back. He made trips down that road almost every day and could have let her down again. Later, detectives received several more calls from people who had seen Haley in that area. Based on their statements, police concluded that the young woman had been on foot along the northwest road towards Mora. Apparently, she could not find any driver at the gas station to give her a ride. For this reason, she decided to walk along the road and try to hitch a ride. Based on the testimony of the next witness, he gave Haley a ride to the turnoff on Gundardo Road, after which she headed further in her direction on foot. The next witness was a woman driving along the road. She spotted Haley just as the young woman was getting out of her car and moving on foot towards Mora. In all, the police were contacted by more than 10 witnesses. After putting their statements together, detectives concluded that the young woman was last seen at about 12 noon on the Northwest Road, about 50 kilometers from Mora. There was another witness, though. He had not seen Haley, but still shared a disturbing observation with police. The man pulled over on the side of the Northwest Road because his engine was overheating. At one point, he heard a dog barking, followed by a piercing female scream. He couldn't see the source of the sound, as it might have been far enough away. The road passed through an empty flat area where there was virtually no extraneous noise. With all this information at hand, the police's prognosis was disappointing from the start. Lead Detective Eddie Rowe decided that they should look for the body and not consider the possibility that Haley might be alive. But management forbade him to investigate in such a manner, leaving it to the status of the search for the missing person. It's worth clarifying here that a murder investigation would have given the police more options than a missing person investigation, but the police had no leads that could help them get on the young woman's trail, so they quickly set about looking for potential kidnappers who lived in the area, but eventually the police focused on 3 men. One worked as a teacher at a local school, another was a part-time gardener there, and the third lived not far from where Haley disappeared. When questioned, each of them pleaded not guilty and provided alibis. The police could not conclude with certainty of their innocence, but they could not find any evidence to the contrary. But soon the situation changed dramatically. The investigators were approached by a neighbor of one of the suspects, a 43-year-old school gardener named Francis Wark. He told them that the day Haley disappeared, Francis borrowed his car to go shopping in Mora. When the man returned home around 1 p.m., a neighbor noticed damage inside the car. The turn signal knob was broken, and the dashboard also showed signs of impact. The neighbor didn't even have time to ask what happened to the car. Francis came home, done with the shopping bags in the kitchen, got on his motorcycle and drove off. This story seemed strange to the police and they decided to re-interview Francis. The man said that at the time of Haley's disappearance he was many kilometers away from the alleged place of her abduction. According to his story, after returning home he immediately went to a party in the city of Perth on his motorcycle. But he was not supposed to get there that day. On the way there, he exceeded the speed limit and had a serious accident that took him to the hospital. The information available was enough for the detectives to ask the perfectly logical question, where was he going in such a hurry? His own testimony seemed very strange, and investigators decided to apply for a search warrant of his home. The officers searched his residence, but they were unable to find any potential evidence. They also searched the car and removed the seat covers so that experts could examine them in the lab. Unfortunately, none of this yielded any results, and Francis was left alone. Almost immediately after that, he moved to the other side of the country, to Queensland, and the detectives were left empty-handed, and the case went into a long drawer. They tried to find new witnesses and evidence to move the investigation forward, but to no avail. This went on for 8 whole years until Francis came back on the police radar in 2007. At the time, he was living in a remote outback in a small settlement. One morning, an elderly couple who lived next door to him were sitting on the porch of their house. Was running in their direction, and her head was covered with blood. She asked for help, and the residents of the house called the police. The victim said that she had been hit by a car and was about to die. She had tried to catch a ride the night before. A man stopped in front of her and offered her a ride. At one point, he told her he needed to go to a place to get gas and fill up his car. They drove up to a house in the middle of nowhere, and he called the woman inside and offered her some tea. Unfortunately for her, she said yes. Almost immediately thereafter, he attacked her and after a brief struggle tied her up. For the next few hours, the victim was subject to indescribable torture and violence. Her assailant also tore off one of her earrings and took it for himself. As you may have guessed, this man was Francis. By morning, the woman realized that she could get the rope off her hands and then free her legs and run. She loosened the rope, waited for the right moment for Francis to move as far away as possible, and rushed to the back door of the house. Before she left, she removed her pendant and tossed it under the bed. The woman feared that the police might not find any corroboration of her story, so she decided to leave some personal item in his house, and it really worked. The police searched Francis' house, found the very same pendant, and arrested the man. After trial, he quickly realized that he could not get away with it and decided to confess to what he had done. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The police in Western Australia, who handled the Haley Dodd case, were notified of Francis' arrest, but they did not appear to be at all interested. No action was taken by the detectives to revive the 8-year-old case, which was so closely resembling the circumstances of Francis' crime. Only through the insistence of Haley's mother did the detectives agree to reopen the case, but they quickly concluded that there was still no evidence against Francis, which meant there was nothing they could do about it. All these years, Haley's family tried to get the police to investigate thoroughly, but they assured them that they had done everything in their power. Desperate to wait for help from law enforcement, the relatives spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, but all to no avail. The case did not take a new turn until 6 long years later, in 2013, when an extremely outrageous fact came to light. It turned out that the police had simply forgotten about the evidence that ended up being the key to the case. The medical examiner, Tracy Horn, filed a request to reopen the investigation. The reason was that the very same car seat covers seized from Francis' neighbor's car in 1999 were found in evidence storage. Suddenly, it turned out that for 14 years, they had never been tested for blood, DNA, and other evidence. When experts did retrieve them, they were immediately able to find a woman's earring that had snagged on the fabric of the covers. Taking a drawing of Lisa's, which she drew for the police just after her friend's disappearance, detectives were horrified to see. It was the same earring that Haley was wearing the morning of her disappearance. But that wasn't all. A human hair was found in one of the car mats that had also been removed from the car. Experts extracted a DNA sample from it that showed a match to Haley Dodd's mother's DNA. That meant that the hair was very likely Haley's own, but that probability was not 100%, which made it very difficult to prosecute Francis in the shortest possible time. As soon as the news leaked to the media, a wave of criticism poured in against the police for 14 years as evidence laid literally under the noses of the investigators, but in all that time, they never remembered it. Of course, such a find instantly changed the course of the case, and the detectives went to the other side of the country to interrogate Francis again. At the time, he was still in prison for assaulting a woman in 2007. The man gave them the same story he had told them 14 years earlier. He denied his involvement and assured them that he was shopping in Moora at the time of Haley's abduction. The interrogation, which lasted nearly 4 hours, was inconclusive, so the police had to prepare the case to go to trial. It wasn't until 2015 when he was formally charged with Haley's murder and deported to Western Australia. 2 more years later, in late 2017, the trial began. Francis' defense insisted that all the evidence presented was circumstantial. The earring Haley bought at a local store was very cheap and popular, so it could have been left in the car by another woman. The hair found in the car showed an almost 100% match to Haley's DNA, but not an absolute exact match. Although a mistake here would have been highly unlikely, that was enough for the lawyers, but all these arguments seemed unconvincing to the judge. Perhaps Francis would still have had a chance to get away with it if not for his crime in 2007. But then he didn't just kidnap a woman who was hitchhiking, he also took her earring. The prosecution believed that the man was collecting the victim's earrings as trophies, which only increased the suspicion against him in the end. As a result, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and murdering Haley Dodd, sentencing him to 21 years in prison. All of this took place while his previous sentence was still pending. Francis was 62 years old at the time of his sentencing, but the story did not end there. The court believed Francis kidnapped and killed Haley, then hid her body, but it was never found and the man himself refused to plead guilty. Haley's mother repeatedly asked the killer to tell her where he hid the body, but to no avail. And in 2018, she helped pass a new law. That says murderers are not eligible for parole if they refuse to reveal the location of their victims' bodies. In 2020, another high-profile event occurred. The court granted Francis appeal to overturn his sentence and scheduled a new hearing. His lawyers again tried to insist that the man would not have had time to kidnap Haley between his trip to Mora and his return home, but the court felt that the time frame allowed him well enough to do so, especially given the rush with which he arrived home and immediately set off for Perth on his motorcycle. Moreover, the earring, along with the hair, were still on the list of key evidence against him. But Francis still managed to get his sentence changed. The court found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reducing his sentence from 21 years to 18 years. But thanks to a law passed in 2018, he would not be able to go free even after that time if he refused to identify the location of the body. There is another point in the whole story that keeps the detectives busy to this day. They are sure that many more women have become victims of Francis and that none of them managed to escape. This maniac could have been picking up young women on the roads for decades, and what happened to them next only he knows. One of the most likely similar cases is the disappearance of a woman in late 2005. She hitchhiked to another city and was never seen again. The detective handling the case is certain that Francis kidnapped her because he knew the victim personally, but there is no evidence at this time. Perhaps the police will find it again in their warehouse a few years later, but it won't make a difference to the perpetrator. If the police had examined the car more thoroughly, Francis would have been arrested back in 1999. Now we can only guess how many lives he ruined in the ensuing years, but sooner or later the mystery may be solved. There's another creepy thing about this whole story. Remember that in the initial stages of the investigation, the police identified 3 main suspects, including Francis? Now, one of them killed his wife and the other, who worked as a school teacher, turned out to be one of the worst child molesters in Australian history. Too bad the police had no way to stop them at the time. If you liked this video, don't forget to support the channel with a like and share your opinion in the comments.